Hello everyone and happy Friday. I'm Nitsahone, and each and every Friday I bring you guys another MTG related top 10 list. Last week I looked at the top 10 sorceries in Magic's history, in other words those who have put up the most impressive tournament finishes. This week we're looking at the opposite end of the spectrum, 10 sorceries that are so bad that there is virtually no situation in which you should play them. This list, unlike last week's list and others like it, is completely based on my own opinion, though it is clear that none of these 10 cards came anywhere close to competitive Magic. There are over 1,700 sorceries in Magic and plenty who have never seen any competitive play, and among those, I selected the ones that I thought were the most terrible. So let's go ahead and get started. At number 10, I have Bargain. Let me start by saying that I hate cards that do nothing but gain you life. If this card were 3 mana to gain 7 life, I still wouldn't think it was a very good card. I only like life gain when it is attached to a relevant effect, and that is generally the case in terms of what life gain cards are worth playing and which ones see play in competitive formats. The problem with this card is it not only does nothing for you but gain you life, it also does something for your opponent. It lets them draw a card. In other words, you just 2-for-1'd yourself to do something that didn't affect the board at all for 3 mana, which probably means you're about to lose the game. It's just a completely terrible card, and likely not even worth playing in EDH, even in a deck that specializes in life gain. If you don't believe me that this card is bad, just compare it to another card that is also generally considered bad, but which is worlds better than this thing, and that is Healing Hands, which for 3 mana only gains you 4 life, but you get to draw the card instead, and that makes it miles better than Bargain. At number 9, we have Book Burning. So, in Judgment, there's a whole cycle of interesting red cards that make opponents choose between two things that are supposed to affect them negatively. Some of the cards in the cycle are fine, with probably Browbeat being the best card in the cycle. This makes an opponent choose between taking 5 or giving you 3 cards, and when you're playing a burn deck against your opponent, that's a pretty rough choice. Obviously, they're going to take the 5 damage, but for 3 mana, that's not the worst rate. There are other cards in this cycle that are decent to bad, but man, Book Burning is absolutely terrible. For 2 mana, you make an opponent choose between taking 6 or putting 6 cards into their graveyard from the top of their library. I wonder which one I will choose. Red isn't a color well known for its ability to mill opponents, so putting 6 cards in the yard is generally not going to hurt someone a whole lot. I suppose if you ever build a blue-red mill deck, maybe you want Book Burning, but in that case, the opposite is true. If you're trying to mill out your opponent, they'll just take 6 and not be too concerned about it, so Book Burning doesn't really have a place anywhere. At number 8, I have Hint of Insanity. In the last week's list of the best sorceries, we saw that efficient discard spells were some of the best sorceries in all of Magic's history. Hint of Insanity is a discard spell, but a terrible one. For 3 mana, you get to see your opponent's hand, and in all likelihood, that's about it, unless they happen to be holding some multiples of cards in their hand. A card that costs you 3 mana should always do something, and this has a good shot at doing nothing. If you decide to play this in any deck, in any format, well, you've got more than just a hint of insanity, I think. At number 7, we have another life gain card, Benedict of Moons, and man, is this one bad. In a typical one-on-one game of Magic, which is what most games of Magic are, you get to gain 2 life for 1 mana. As noted earlier, gaining life and doing nothing else is usually not worth it, unless the life gain is at a very impressive rate, in which case the card can be a pretty good sideboard card against aggro or burn, but Benedict of Moons doesn't do that. Oh, it has Haunt, you say? Oh boy. So you get the chance to maybe gain 4 life off of 1 card. Such value. Yes, you still shouldn't play it. At number 6, I have Bakis Curse. The text here is old and a bit convoluted, so I'll read you the errata text. Not that it makes the card any better, but here it is. Bakis Curse deals 2 damage to each creature for each aura attached to that creature. Now, this card, I guess, unlike some on the list, might have a place in some very narrow situations. Let's say maybe siding it in against Boggles in Modern, for example. Except for that it costs 4 mana. Also, it's not legal in Modern. This is obviously theoretical. But this costs 4 mana, so any deck that specializes in auras is going to have you dead or close to it by the time you tap out to cast this thing with their huge, oversized creatures. What's more is, most creatures that have a lot more than 2 toughness once they have an aura put on them. So unless your opponent is really stacking auras onto a single creature, this probably isn't going to do much anyway. It's better to just play cards that force opponents to sacrifice creatures with hexproof and similar effects. And against the vast majority of decks out there, Bakis Curse just does stone nothing. At number 5, I have Dubious Challenge. That's right, a card that is basically brand new has already cracked this list. What an honor for Dubious Challenge. This card is just horrendous. There's really no getting around that. Building a deck that can effectively use this thing is a dubious challenge indeed. For 4 mana, you get to look at the top 10 cards of your library and choose 2 creatures from them. Sounds pretty good so far, right? Well, not really. Your opponent then gets to look at the 2 creatures you choose and choose the one that they want, then you get whatever is left over. I'm honestly baffled by the existence of this card at all, as even in really silly decks, like let's say a deck running Bronze Bombshell, this doesn't work. Why? Because it says the opponent may choose to put the card in play, so Bronze Bombshell and things like Phage the Untouchable just don't do anything. Your opponent will just choose not to take them. I'm fairly certain they printed this card to be the joke version of the sort of similar and completely broken Collected Company. If that's not why they did it, I'm not really sure why they did. At number 4, I have Endemic Plague. For 4 mana, this terrible card asks you to sacrifice a creature, then it destroys all creatures that shared a creature type with that creature. Wait, what? Yeah, it sort of seems like this could be playable if you sort of jumble the words around a little bit differently, but it really isn't. Why? Because you have to sacrifice your own creature, and generally, your creature isn't going to have the same creature type as your opponent's. You can't really control what creature types your opponent has in play, so you may just be blowing up all of your own creatures. So there's really no way of controlling that. Want to get cute and sacrifice a changeling, for example? Well, you can, but then you still blow up all of your own creatures. Though, I guess in that case, this is roughly damnation, but even then, that requires a lot of setup, and it's just not what you want to be doing. At number 3, I have Leeches. This card removes all poison counters from a player and then does 1 damage to them for each poison counter removed. That's pretty bad. Obviously, you don't want to be using this if you're the player who is doing the poisoning because you want to kill them with poison counters because it's easier than killing them with damage. But if you're playing against a player who is trying to win with poison counters, maybe you want this in your deck, in your sideboard maybe. No, not really. The majority of decks that can win with poison in basically any format can do it in one swing anyway, so being able to remove poison counters isn't really going to do anything. This is why a card like Melira is so good, because she just stops poison counters from getting put anywhere. At number 2, I have Ristic Siphon. In Prophecy, there's a whole cycle of Ristic cards that all do something extra or something in general if your opponent can't pay a certain amount of mana. The most famous of these, because of its ubiquity in Commander, is probably Ristic Study. Well, Ristic Siphon is the terrible, terrible cousin of Ristic Study. Ristic Study is good because it is an enchantment. That means the effect lasts forever until the enchantment gets blown up, and it makes your opponent play the game differently, or else you get to draw extra cards, and that's a pretty big thing that you don't want your opponent to be doing, is drawing extra cards. Ristic Siphon, on the other hand, is a sorcery and a one-shot card, and if your opponent can pay the 3 mana, well, it just did absolutely nothing. That means you were holding on to a clunky 5 mana spell and waiting to cast it until your opponent doesn't leave 3 mana up. Having that kind of setup for a card like this is pretty terrible, but maybe it has a really big payoff once you play it. No, not really. On top of that, once you can actually cast Ristic Siphon and your opponent doesn't have 3 mana to pay, it's not going to be game-breaking. Yeah, it provides a 10-point life swing, but you also just didn't do anything to affect the board, and you just tapped 5 mana and had to wait for an opportune time to cast it. All of those things combined probably mean you're facing some serious pressure. And finally, at number 1, we have, well, One with Nothing. The other cards on this list are unplayable, certainly, but One with Nothing brings new meaning to that. For 1 mana, you get to discard your hand. That's simple. Elegant design, right? Why would you ever want to do that, though? I mean, really, have a Hellbent deck? Well, you're still going to get run over by your opponent's newfound card advantage, no matter what you discard. I guess it could be a really terrible way to set up, for example, an Unburial Rites reanimation, but there are literally dozens of better ways to do that in every format than casting One with Nothing, which involves you losing all of your cards in your hand, including your removal and things like that, and that's just not what you want to be doing. Well, that does it for this week's Top 10. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click the like button. In the comments, let me know what terrible sorceries you think should have made the list. And if you want to make sure you catch MTG Top 10s every week and a lot of other great MTG content, don't forget to subscribe. Also, I want to remind you guys that my content is sponsored in part by 5colorcombo.com. You should go check it out for great MTG content, a great MTG store, and even a great Magic the Gathering smartphone app. You can use my discount code NITSAHONE5 in the store for a 5% discount. Anyway, thanks for watching.